Hi, I'm Scott Lucas. We're here at the University of Birmingham marking International Women's Day. It's 100 years since the first female MP, Nancy Astor. A century later, we have a woman who is Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. We have women First Ministers of Scotland, of Northern Ireland, more than 200 women MPs, including chairs of powerful committees. But beyond the numbers, and looking at politics generally, should we really be celebrating this day? Or should we instead be marking the challenges that still face all of us? Well, I'm here to learn. And I'm going to learn from four of the best folks here at the University of Birmingham. They're going to talk through these issues at a personal and at a professional level. Jane Martin, Kieran Trahan, Catherine Mangan, and Ramali Rampathirana. I hope you'll sit back and listen with me as we learn a lot from this discussion. To kick it off, folks, I thought I might ask you, when I was growing up, I had certain icons and certain models. Now, do each of you have a model today? When you think about women in politics, do you have a model for what you think all of us should be doing? Or am I really approaching this the wrong way with that question?
Thanks, Scott. I think you ask a really pertinent question, but I'd almost like to shift the dial in the conversation a little bit, because this notion of role models is both an opportunity and problematic. So in celebrating Women's International Day, of course it's a celebration and a recognition of how far women have come in politics. That's one perspective. As far as role models are come, you know, they're very few and far between. So it's a really difficult one. And I'd like to kind of change that conversation and say, what would kind of, you know, political female leaders look like in the future? And could we maybe redesign the conversation about role models so that we don't end up trying to walk in other people's shoes, but we learn to walk in our own shoes?
The only thing I would add to that, and I'm not a subscriber to the role model approach, but I also think it's important, bearing in mind the number of women that have been written out of history, that we don't forget the past successes of women. So if I was going to say, and I don't think she's necessarily a role model, but a woman I have found inspirational is actually Barbra Castle, one of the early cabinet ministers. She was the first female minister for transport. She introduced the breathalyzer test, and in terms of thinking about reflections maybe about the experiences of women in politics today, one of the things that she commented on in her diaries was the hate mail that she received from male drivers. She was a non-driver, which is quite interesting to hold this role. But she also commented on a letter that she got from a woman who thanked her for giving her her husband back. She said he used to go to the pub on his own to play darts, but now he takes me with him so I can drive him. And I just thought, you know, that says a kind of lot on all that kinds of levels. I don't know.
Well, I was going to add, I definitely agree with you in the sense that the concept of role models, I think, is slightly outdated, because we should be like looking at each other as women. We're all role models, but I do think it's important to kind of appreciate and have gratitude for those who did, you know, put down the formations I'm talking about here, like the Women's Social and Political Union, the Pankhurst, you know, the whole notion of words not deeds. That's, I think, even to this day, iconic. It's something that has completely shifted the whole entire political axes. And so I think, though 100% moving forward, women as role models, I think, should be kind of viewed as a collective. I think it's also important to remember those who definitely did set, you know, the groundwork for what we're doing today.
So I tend to agree with the rest of the panel. I think this idea of a role model is slightly problematic because it sort of stems from that sort of very, you know, sense of positional power. And I think what we're trying to move away from is that sense of the sort of the hero leader, the person who has, you know, all of the answers, who doesn't need to work with anyone else to come up with new solutions. So I'd like to sort of pick little bits from lots of different women and use them as my inspiration.
Let me follow on with that then and say, y'all seem to be talking about the idea of not just holding one up above the rest, but talking about communities and talking about interaction. Do you have a sense, both within communities, but at that sort of higher level, the way that women are presented, that the perception is shifting, that we are getting a perception that this isn't a question of an exceptional woman, but just simply a natural position that women are part of communities and are making differences. Are we getting wiser in the way that we approach this, in other words?
I think clearly if we were to think back to Nancy Astor, it's far more normalised to see a female MP now than it was when Astor entered the House of Commons. But I do very much think there are still, it's no notion of linear progress, so there very much are still issues for women, one of which I was thinking around kind of sexual harassment, which is clearly much more topical now and much more part of everyday discourse in the sense that younger women are drawing attention to it and celebrities, etc. But it was very much there in the earlier days as well. And so in terms of thinking about kind of the culture of politics, I'd actually kind of like us to reflect on that a bit and what might encourage more women to go into politics. Because another concern I had reading quite recently, you know, if we think about women in the political sphere more broadly, in Parliament, women volunteers and interns currently aren't covered by legislation around sexual harassment at work, and clearly there's been some famous examples in politics of that abuse of power.
Very much so.
No, I agree with Jane, and I'd like to sort of look at it from the local government world. So the sort of, you know, the grassroots of politics, where we know there are lots of, you know, fantastic women doing brilliant work, but actually it's very difficult for women to get into local politics. There's a large number of barriers, you know, not least the sort of, you know, the cliff edge after 4 years potentially. If you're, you know, a mother, a single parent, it's very difficult to rely on a political career as your main income. There is also a huge amount of sexism still in council chambers, and we know that most local authorities still do not have maternity leave policies for female elected members, which, you know, means that it's very difficult for them to join that.
Yeah, so I would like to just lead on from that, talking about, I think there's this kind of existence of the notion that women, when they're trying to be participating in politics, can you do that as well as having caring and domestic responsibilities? The fact that Jacinda Ardern is the only leader, the second leader in the whole of history to have given birth while in office, I think that speaks for itself. So, and it kind of begs the question, are we, from even like going back to grassroots, are we implementing into women that they can't be both? Is it mutually exclusive? Why can't you be both, you know, politically ambitious and also a mother? It's, yeah, something I definitely think that's important to discuss.
I think sort of all the panellists have highlighted some really, for me, interesting insights and to further the debate. And if I go back to this notion of community, 70% of our current MPs are male. And then you ask, okay, within that 30%, how many of them come from local communities? And there lies your answer. So it is about having aspiration. It's also about looking at the barriers. But for me, we often spend too much time having a conversation about the barriers. So I think it's really important to say, how do we rise? You know, how do we increase those aspirations? How do we reduce those barriers? And so what we end up doing is not getting to the underlying heart of some of those issues. How much of them are about discrimination and how much of those are about perception? Because if we don't change perception, we won't change discrimination.
That raises a really interesting question that was running through my mind as I heard both of you. Sorry. Yeah. That raises an interesting question for me is I was hearing each of you, which was this interaction between the cultural and the structural, as it were. And, you know, is it a question that we just haven't been smart enough? And now that we do identify sexual harassment, we do identify questions such as maternity care, we're getting smarter as a culture, but possibly we aren't dealing with the structural issues even as we can claim to be more enlightened. But I realize these sort of work off of each other. So I guess to try to unpick it for me, and I know maybe the wrong way, but if there is a single step amongst the many that need to be taken if there's a single step that you would recommend that we pursue, whether it's cultural, structural, economic, social, what would it be?
For me, in really simple terms, we need to have far more reverse mentoring, so that it's the very groups that we want to see in those political leadership positions who are developing the understanding of others, and that way we move away from this deficit model, i.e. it's those community groups, it's those females that need, the additional training. They need the additional kind of leadership qualities. No, they don't. They're doing it. Leadership in the most mundane places, in everyday places. That's what's required.
Also, though, in terms of thinking about structural issues, there is a real issue when you think about candidate selection. So there are problems at that point in terms of whether females getting through. And beyond that, changes could be made in terms of thinking about women being more likely to be given winnable seats, because that historically has been a big issue and remains it, so that they're less likely to get the chance of getting in.
I think creating better networks for women. We know how the Old Boys Network works, fantastically for men. That's great. But what is the equivalent for women? I don't think we necessarily, as women, always put enough time into that because we don't always recognise it as important. But that is the way that you will get that reverse mentoring, that peer-to-peer support, that sense of what is it really like to do some of these roles and how can we help each other to understand when we come in. So actually 4 years later, we're not thinking about, I'm never doing that again. That was a once and only, experiment. So I think creating much better networks for each other.
I think I'm going to approach this slightly sociologically, but I think it kind of really does start young. The fact that women, this kind of whole imposter syndrome, it's kind of drilled into us. Can we run the country? Are we qualified to do that? We have so much self-doubt. And I can say that I've never wanted to be Prime Minister, but even, I'm 21, and even growing up, I knew that anytime I wanted to take charge, I was bossy. And I was, controlling. And things like that, we drill it into young women's head that this is how to think, and it's not. So I think for me, it starts a lot younger, and then, as the rest of the panel said, all these factors tie in. But for me, 100% it's eradicating this initial thought that we can't do it, because we absolutely can.
I think if we could eradicate imposter syndrome, that would be
would
fantastic.
Yes,
And one way of doing that is to really think about what it means to create inclusive leadership, inclusive cultures. And that shifts the debate then, and it shifts the actions. So less talk, more action.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'm going to put you all on the spot as we kind of bring this to a close. 5 years from now, if we ever get past Brexit, and if we ever get past the domination of Westminster politics, 5 years from now, do you think the position will improve for women in not only these political but these social and cultural contexts? Or do you think we're in a period where there will continue to be these difficulties and these challenges and not as much progress as we would like to celebrate when it comes to International Women's Day 2024?
It's concerning, because if we think beyond the world of Westminster, the analysis that's been done so far around the gendered impact of Brexit would suggest that women are going to be disproportionately impacted on, especially if we think of who's more likely to be, on universal credit and things like that. So and that would be another issue I'd want to raise. It's not about, I don't think any of us are sitting here thinking that we want female representation on some kind of essentialist notion. And there's also thinking about sort of the policies and approaches that are given priority as well, in terms of thinking about the impact that politics can have on more of those community lives and everything. And so that's something to consider.
I think obviously stats don't lie. So going to the 2015 general election, 193 women MPs. 2017, there's 203. So obviously we're seeing progress, whether it's slow or not. And I think even going beyond the UK, the 116th Congress, 127 women sworn into office. So I think we're absolutely going to see progress 5 years from now. And I think there's more awareness of it. It might be slow, but the fact there's discussion about it, we're here talking about it, I think definitely, I'm hopeful. I think there's going to be progress for sure.
But it is interesting looking at this middle group that have split away, and already the sort of, well, it seemed the person they were speculating who's going to lead, it's Chukwuramu. I mean, who knows? I don't know, but there's a lot of unknowns.
I concur with what you said. I think, we have to have that dream and we have to have that vision, otherwise, why bother? But I also think there is something, a bigger question to be asked, and I think the question I would want to leave us thinking about is, can we afford for change to be as slow as it has? No. And can we afford not to have more women politicians and female in leaders in these kinds of both key roles, but key roles, throughout society, not just kind of in politics? And my answer is a simple one: no, we can't.
I am optimistic, although when I think 5 years ago, I'm not sure how far we've moved on, but my sense is that the generation of young people coming through will not wear what we have borne and sort of coped with, and I think there is going to be a real change, and I very much hope to be back here in 5 years' time discussing how fantastic it all is.
Well, I am afraid you've now committed yourselves to be here 5 years from now while we review this. I want to thank each and every one of you, because there are challenges ahead, but you've given me at least a bit of hope. I suspect you've given some folks out there a bit of hope. I want to thank all of you who've been watching with us, wherever you are. I hope you can celebrate International Women's Day. We've been joining you from the University of Birmingham. We hope to see you again soon. Y'all be decent to each other.